Hello, today is October 10th, 2016. I'm meeting today with Mr. Clayton Nattier, here in Arvada, Colorado, to talk about his World War II experiences. My name is Brad Hoops. I'm the interviewer for the Northern Colorado Veterans History Project. Welcome, Clayton, and thanks for sitting down to tell your story today.
Thank you.
Let's start out, if we could. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your date of birth, where you were born, a little bit about your family.
Well, I was born in January 1923 in Concordia, Kansas. Concordia is just straight north of Wichita and almost to the Nebraska line. And I grew up there and went to high school, graduated from high school in Concordia.
What'd your father do for a profession?
He was with the Folgers Coffee Company.
Really?
In those days, the coffee representatives went to every grocery store, and everybody that bought Folgers coffee to have on their shelf or to use in a restaurant bought it through the Folgers representative. He had about probably a fourth of the state of Kansas that he covered, and he did that from 1915 until he retired in 55.
Is that right?
Oh yeah, a long time.
Did you have any siblings?
Yes, had a brother and a sister.
And where did you fit in that
Brother
order?
was 7 years older than I, and my sister was a couple years younger.
Okay, all right. Well, one question I like to ask your generation, I don't know if you have much memory of it, but was your family much affected by the Great Depression?
Probably a lot more than I realized. I think maybe most families shielded their children a little bit, or wanted to at least. And but there in my area, Concordia was a rather small town, about 6,000 people, and an agricultural community and an agricultural part of the state. And so people in that area got along better than the industrial part of the country. And the farmers would grow their own crops, and with that sort of thing, the meat and the vegetables and all that sort of thing were homegrown. So they got along better than most places did, and I think as a result, even the people in town got along better.
Okay, gotcha. And how about, I don't know if it was too far east, but was Concordia affected much by the Dirty 30s, the Dust Bowl? And what was that?
But not to the extent that the south and west of us. And down in the Wichita area, it was just horrible. And from Wichita west, it was horrible into Colorado. And but it was not good where we were, and we had to seal around doors and windows and that sort of thing, because the dust would be in the air and blow in any little crevice that was open. And so it was not good where we were, but not anywhere near as bad as other parts in the state.
Wow. So you went through the school system there at Concordia and graduated?
Yes, graduated in 1940, and but I was 17 when I graduated, and my parents said, well, it might be a good idea for you to take a year of postgraduate work in the high school. So while I was taking chemistry and things of that sort, in the post-grad, I took accounting and bookkeeping and typing. The typing served me well for a long, long time. And so that year of post-grad, which, you know, can be wasted if you're not taking something of interest and something of value. But in later years, I thought that was one valuable year.
Is that right?
I had some good courses.
So there wasn't actually college courses? It was...
in high school.
Oh, it was?
In the high school.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, so I imagine you graduated in the spring of 40?
Yes,
so the whole year.
Right. May of 40.
And then after that 1 year of postgraduate, did you go on to college then, or what was?
I went to Kansas State I was going to say university. It wasn't university then. I enrolled in chemical engineering as a freshman, and but that was the extent of my pre-war education, because come Pearl Harbor in December 7th of 41, that was when I enrolled in the fall of 41.
Right.
And so I went over to Fort Riley.
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt, but do you remember where you were and what you were thinking when you heard about Pearl Harbor?
I was in Manhattan, Kansas, well along in that first semester, and I met a friend of mine on the street as I was going from one friend's house to another. We were going to do some studying together, and this guy I ran into said, "Did you hear about Pearl Harbor?" I had no idea what Pearl Harbor was.
Yeah, sure. Nobody did, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And so he kind of brought me up to date, but I knew before that when I went into the service, which we knew months and months before that was going to happen sometime.
You could see it on the horizon, the war?
I should say.
Oh, okay.
And I knew that I wanted to have something to do with flying.
Really?
And preferably in bombers. And but I took the exam for aviation cadet over at Fort Riley, which was just very close to Manhattan, Kansas. And that was in mid-January, and passed it and was eligible to go to cadet training. And but I think that happened all over the country, that thousands of people did that about my age.
Mm-hmm.
And so by the end of January, thousands of them were ready to go into training, and thought it would be day after tomorrow when they went. Well, they just couldn't handle all these people at once. I wasn't called until October.
Really?
October of 42.
Huh.
And that's when I went to Santa Ana, California, and started my training.
And how was that? Here you're going from civilian life into military life. Was that much of an adjustment for you? Coupled with, growing up in Kansas, I imagine you hadn't traveled too far away from home. Now you're clear all over on the West Coast. How was that? That whole experience?
Well, it was a big shock to me. I had never been terribly far. Well, we made a few trips, but they were east.
Yeah.
To Washington and New York and things
okay.
of that sort. And never been anywhere west except Colorado, where we went on vacation several times during the 20s and 30s. And so I was sent to Santa Ana, California, and that's where they had the classification center for the Army Air Corps. And we were given courses in Morse code and about the theory of flight and things of that nature, and part of it was just an aptitude test, I think, because some of them I thought, well, this is unrelated to what I hope I get into, and but in the end, then after all the testing and so on, they said, well, you can take your choice between taking navigator training and pilot training. And I said I would prefer pilot training. And so that's the way it happened. From Santa Ana, I was assigned to primary training in also in California.
Mm-hmm. That's okay.
Know the town as well as
That's fine. That's okay. That's not a problem.
But this was where my destination was Hancock College of Aviation, and it was a civilian training center for pilots. And when I got there, the barracks were painted white, and things were, everything else trimmed with blue, so all beautiful stuff. In the dining room where we ate, white tablecloths and all this sort of thing. And I thought, man, this cadet stuff is really going to be fancy. I'm going to enjoy this, gosh. And so I went through the primary training, got my solo flight, and finished the training there, and from there went to what we call basic training. You would think that would be the first.
Right.
Not so, it was the middle. And in basic training, I went to Lemoore, California, and we flew the BT-13 is what the airplane was called. The Stearman was the one we flew a biplane in primary. But this BT-13 was a much more powerful airplane than the Stearman had been. And we learned our instructors taught us how to do loops and slow rolls and snap rolls and things of that sort. And it really was things that were a lot of fun. But, you know, particularly in hindsight, it became obvious that these acrobatics that we were doing were not just for fun. You know, when you were in an airplane and you were, say, in a fighter plane, like this single engine BT-13 might have been considered, and you were attacked by another plane and you were diving or in a loop and you stalled out and you got in a spin, it taught you how to get out of trouble.
Okay.
Doing those things. And that was the reason that they taught us all these things. They never said why. Would you like to go out and have some fun? Doing spins and all these things. But it taught us how to get out of trouble with that kind of training. And when we finished the primary training at Lemoore, then the question was, did you want to fly fighters, or would you rather fly bombers or twin engine or multi-engine airplanes? I said I would like to fly a 4-engine bomber, preferably the biggest bomber that they had, because I thought I could do more damage as one person in the crew on the bomber,
Right.
than one person anywhere else might be able to do.
Okay.
And that would bring the war to an end quicker.
Okay.
And well, it turned out that the training was in multi-engine planes was at Stockton, California, and we flew AT-17s, which was a Cessna. They called it UC-78 before the designation by the Air Corps of AT-17. It was a civilian airplane that they had sold for quite some time, but it was ideal for multi-engine training of cadets. We also had a Canadian plane called the AT-20, yellow fabric on it and a little bigger than the AT-17. The reason we had that, they said it had characteristics similar to a B-17. But at the time, or in hindsight, or anywhere along the way, I never could see the similarity between that airplane and a B-17. But it was nice to have the two types to fly at night and fly in formation the way we would be doing in bombers and that sort of thing. So it was a lot of different type of training in those twin engine planes. And navigation too was one of the things that the pilots needed to know So we used maps to navigate our way about in the San Joaquin Valley of California. And it was nice to get back where you belong at the end of those trips. And so in August of 1944, then I was finished with the primary and basic and advanced training for flying. And I got my wings at that time and a commission. And so the next stop was B-17 training, and I was sent to Roswell, New Mexico, where the training was just very intense in the B-17. As I remember, we had just 2 students per instructor. The instructor that I had me for a student and one other fellow, and he just worked us unbelievably. And we'd take off, go around the field, come in and land again, not cut the engines and take off, and all this took quite a bit of pressure on the controls. And before that was over, I had blisters on my hands that I'd never had before, not like that.
Wow.
And but it was intense in many ways. There again, one of the instructor's tasks was to teach us how to get out of trouble. He would cut an engine when we were taking off after we'd had some experience. And what do you do with an engine that's suddenly not running? And that sort of thing. And then taught us how to feather an engine. Feathering means that when the engine quits, you know, the propeller would be acting like a windmill, you know, just turning in the wind, and it would be quite a drag, really. And feathering it turned the prop so that it had the least resistance to the wind. All this surface was right into the wind instead of turning sideways. And so that was part of the training. How do you feather it and why, and all these things. And so that training was very intense.
Now,
I don't want to belabor it, but go ahead.
Now, did you have a choice between the 17 and the 24, or were you just assigned to a B-17?
I wanted the B-17, and that's what where they sent me.
Okay.
So that's what I asked for, really. I'm not sure that it would, if I had asked for 24s, if I would have been sent somewhere else. I don't know.
And then an earlier question I wanted to ask you earlier, prior to your service, had you ever been up in an airplane before?
One time.
Yeah?
That was in Denver. We came out here every now and then on vacation, and my dad found that there was a little airport or somewhere around Denver where a guy was taking people up, passengers going for a ride for $5.
Wow.
And so I got to go for a ride in that airplane for $5, and I really enjoyed it. It was interesting to see him flying the plane and to see what you see when you're up there in the airplane. So but that was my first and only experience before going in pilot training.
Well, let's take your story ahead now. So you finished B-17 school. Where do you go from there?
They sent the whole class from Roswell, New Mexico to Salt Lake City just as a transfer or assignment point. And from there we were assigned to various places for crew training. I was assigned to Sioux City, Iowa.
Now, did you pick up your crew there? Did you meet your crew in Salt Lake, or?
No.
Okay.
It was just the pilots that were in there.
Okay.
And so we went to, good many of us went to Sioux City, Iowa, and I imagine they were sent various other places too. But that was that gave me an opportunity to stop and visit my parents
Right.
on the way from Salt Lake
Yeah,
City to Sioux City, Iowa. I had got a ride with a friend of mine who was one of the rare people who had a car.
All right, yeah.
And he let me off in Belleville, Kansas. I went down and visited my parents for a day and got back on a bus and went to Sioux City. But there I did pick up a crew, and the crew amounted to a total of 10 people. The pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, top turret gunner, radio operator, 2 waist gunners, and a ball turret gunner, and a tail gunner. And so they were a group of 10 that started training in that airplane. And the story that kind of got around, I think, pretty widely was that nobody had been in B-17 knew anything about it except the pilot. Well, I'm not sure that was true, because the top turret gunner was also called the engineer, and this top turret was right behind the pilots, and he would stand back there in his turret, ready to fire his guns when that was necessary. The rest of the time, he was right behind the pilots, looking at the instruments and watching what was going on, and if anything was unusual, he was to notify the pilots and suggest whatever he thought might be the problem. So I think he had probably had some training ahead of going into the crew, because those fellows, some of them knew quite a bit about the plane, others very little. So I wish I knew where they had been, one by one.
Right,
I
right,
don't.
right.
And but we started the training there, and we'd give the co-pilot the chance to take off in this B-17. The co-pilot had all this training except the 4-engine bomber, so he hadn't had any of that. And but there were some real problems in the crew training there at Sioux City, Iowa, like there were many places. For instance, one day a crew went up and they lost a number 4 engine, the one on the extreme right, and it went out. And the pilot told the co-pilot to feather that engine. Well, he didn't. He feathered the one right next to it. And well, they gave it power, then that plane just went over and dived right into the ground.
Wow.
And because they were both wrong. You know, the pilot should have known better than to do that. The co-pilot should have known not to feather that wrong engine. But when the pilot put power on there, it just raised that airplane up and dived right into the ground. And it's just one of the mistakes that those green crews could make. But we heard about that one for quite a long time, and there were many mistakes that we made. But we would go out on bombing runs. What we would use was little bombs. Sometimes they didn't even have any explosive in them, but most of the time they were small bombs, 100 pounds or so, that the bombardier would drop on his target, and he would be graded on how close he came to the target. And the navigator, when we did missions specifically for his benefit, it would be navigating somewhere around the country, and not terribly far away for the most part. And he had to trace the plan that he had set up and take notes on where we were at which time and when we turned and where we went each step of the way. And then he turned that into to the headquarters when we got back.
And for those that are watching this tape, this is all before computers.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
And GPS.
Yeah, right.
Yes, GPS would have been nice. But the navigator had some very good experience with navigating around the countryside into other states and back. One day I asked him to plan a trip to go over Concordia,
Uh-huh.
Kansas, and he did, and we went to Concordia and flew over at about 1,500 feet, which of course is a very safe and not a very noticeable height. Of course, the B-17 makes so much noise that in that town they did notice it. But the real problem was that there was a prisoner of war camp just outside of the town where German prisoners were held there, people that had been taken prisoner in North Africa. And those people worked on farms around the area because the farmers needed help in the worst way
Mm-hmm.
with so many of their offspring in the service. So they filled a very important job in the area. But the problem we had was that the commandant, the commander of that prisoner of war camp, saw this bomber coming over his prisoner of war camp, and he thought that some crazy guys were going to bomb his prisoners. And he just had a fit, I guess. A lot of people in town knew about it, and he was trying to find out who was flying that airplane, where they came from. He never did find out, so that was fine. But I didn't even know there was a prisoner of war camp there in Concordia. But following all this training, including the gunnery practice and all that sort of thing, we were ready to go overseas in about March of 1944. And our crew training had started in November 43. And we were getting checked out by a check writer, and he would check every crew member, doing a little navigation, doing a bomb run on something or other, and see how the bombardier did, and other positions, and he would ask each crew member questions that told him that everything was all right or it was not all right. But he finally came to the end of that testing of the crew and said, well, let's go up to 32,000 feet and fly some formation. And we had never been to 32,000 feet. And matter of fact, never went to 32,000 again. And we did go up and fly formation with the plan that he had made with another check rider. And the B-17 is very mushy most of the time at 32,000 feet. But we did fly formation. We didn't hit anybody, and that was fortunate. But we got through with that, and that was the last part of the check. And he said, well, we're fine. We're all done, and everybody passed. Let's go in and land. And so we started down, and I had a horrible cold that day, and as we went down 2,000 or 3,000 feet, my ears were not clearing, and I said, my ears aren't clearing. I need to go back up and let them clear and then go in and land. And he said, no, let's just go on in and land. And we did. And about 5 minutes after I got out of the airplane, was walking across the tarmac, my ears just sounded like they exploded. They imploded, I guess. And both ear jumps were ruptured. And So I spent the next 3 months or so in the hospital there at Sioux City and waiting for those eardrums to heal. And they finally did, and I got a new crew in May, and we went through all this training again and got ready to go overseas and in June. But it was late enough that we saw we were going to we missed D-Day. We left for Kearney, Nebraska, along and just after D-Day had taken place. And we were crazy enough to wish we had been there. And when we got to Sioux City, or to Kearney, Nebraska, we got new airplanes that were just loaded with freight of one sort or another. Freight that various bomb groups had ordered, they needed from the States. So for these new airplanes, they used them as freight haulers. And so we had all that freight in our airplanes, and we were also principally checking out the airplane to see that everything was okay and that it worked properly. And I only know of one example. There probably were others, but of things that weren't quite right. And this one was really a bad one. A good friend of mine they were out checking their plane, and the propeller flew off the airplane, just took off. And so that was a bit of a problem that had to be repaired before we left. But we finally got all of the planes ready to go, and we went to Manchester, New Hampshire on our first stop. And when we got there, it had been raining, and it rained for the next several days, so it was a while before we could take the next flight. And our next stop was to be Goose Bay, Labrador. And but we went up one day, got to Goose Bay, and they said it's socked in solid and you can't land, go back to Bangor, Maine. And so we went back there for an overnight stay, and the following day we went to Goose Bay, Labrador. And from Goose Bay we went to Iceland, and that was just a stop along the way going to England. And the navigator had, I thought, a considerable problem going over, because the weather people had told us you'd be flying with an overcast above you here and an undercast here, and change your altitude as you go along. This altitude for so long, this one for so long. And the surprising thing was those weather people were right. And we had the overcast and undercast, but occasionally there would be a little glimpse of light through the overcast, and the navigator could get a fix on where we were. And but as we approached Iceland, he told me to take this heading and let down, and at 1,500 feet. And he said by the time we break out at 1,500 feet, we should be under this undercast, and we should be able to see the field. And as it turned out, when we broke out under the clouds, we were lined up with the runway, right there. So we all thought our navigator was top notch. And and the tower said, don't fly the pattern, they just come right on in and land.
Is it Iceland or Greenland? You have to go fly in the fjord there.
That's Greenland.
Greenland, okay.
Very glad we didn't go there.
Yeah.
Some folks never came back from there.
Yeah.
But that was a nice welcome into Iceland, and having been directed exactly to the runway, you might say.
Uh,
And we were only there for about 24 hours to refuel and get some sleep and head on to Wales. We landed in Hampstead, Wales, sometime well, we landed there the 4th of July, 1944. But we lost our airplane, of course. We knew we wouldn't be able to keep that airplane because some bomb group had many losses and they needed that airplane, and somebody else maybe needed the freight that was in it. So we lost the whole thing, and they sent us by train then over to the 306 bomb group at Thurleigh, England. Thurleigh. It's a very small town, but the air base was right beside that small town. And I didn't fly until the 28th of July, and that was my first mission. The pilot had to fly 2 missions with an experienced crew that had been on missions before.
okay.
Because they didn't know what these green crews and pilots
Sure.
how they might react, and they wanted to be sure that they didn't react badly when they saw flak or fighters or anything of that sort. And so that's why they had the pilots fly 2 missions with an experienced crew. And then following that, on my 3rd mission, I flew with my own crew. And we flew in very frequent missions, and actually we were there at the base from July 28th until we were shot down. It was about 6 weeks.
Oh, wow.
And I had the 16th mission was the one where we got shot down. We went to Merseburg on one of these missions that I flew with another crew, and Merseburg was where there was a synthetic oil refinery where they made all kinds of fuels from coal, and they could make grease to high test gasoline, everything from coal. And I had heard about that and studied very little about it, but knew about it when I had that one semester of chemistry in Kansas State. And it was a process that was not economical for the United States to use, because it was very expensive to convert the coal to all these other fluids, from grease to high test gasoline. But the Germans had to have it, and that's why they built this huge plant at the small town of Merseburg. And Merseburg was just east of Merseburg was west of Leipzig. I'm not sure how far, 50 miles or so such, and south of Berlin. But most of the crew landed close to the target because we got hit by a piece of flak just as we were on the IP, we call it, initial point.
Oh, okay.
And that IP was when you fly the airplane very steadily. You don't move in any direction, up, down, or sideways, so that the bombardier can have a level platform to drop his bombs from. Now, the lead plane had the Norden bomb sight, which was a highly technical and secret piece of equipment.
Right.
But other planes behind the lead plane would drop their bombs when they saw them come out of that lead plane.
Oh, wow, okay.
And so the bombardiers, I'm sure, didn't like to be called toggleers. They occasionally sent sergeants up there which could watch the planes ahead and drop their bombs on when they saw them ahead. And they were called toggle ears, and they did a good job. But they didn't want to have these Norden bomb sights in every plane, in few as possible, really, because of the top secret nature of them. And but on that IP, 1 minute from the initial point until bombs away, we were hit by apparently a small piece of flak, and it hit just came through the fuselage just ahead of the instrument panel, ahead of the co-pilot, and just started a massive fire just instantaneously.
Oh boy!
And so I called the crew right away. It was so massive and obvious that it was not going to be controlled or put out with any ease, if at all, and gave them orders to bail out. And the 4 guys in the back did go out and landed relatively close to the target, which was not too great.
Yeah.
The last 2 of us that went out, the top turret gunner and I, the gunner had stayed there trying to put this fire out all this time. And by all this time, I'm talking 2 minutes, 3 minutes, I don't know how long. Seemed like a long time to me, but it was not. But the other 3 guys, the co-pilot, bombardier, and navigator, were up in the nose, or in the navigator and bombardier's area, in the nose part, by a hatch which was open. That was an escape hatch that the crew could use to bail out if you had a problem. They were sitting around that hatch with the navigator facing me when we started to go out, wanted to go out. Navigator was facing me, the bombardier was over here, and the co-pilot had his back to me. But it was later found that the co-pilot apparently was in shock just because of this, and that could happen to anybody.
Sure.
And because he took a swing at the top turret gunner when he was trying to put the fire out, when he finally went up in front. And but the gunner said that he was just wild-eyed, and I think the 2 other guys, bombardier and navigator, were trying to get the co-pilot to bail out, and they couldn't get him to bail out, and they never did leave the airplane. They were killed, all 3.
Is that right?
Yeah, just a horrible thing that never should have happened, but it did. But the 2 of us, the top turret gunner and I, after starting up in front, and with the navigator saying no, just couldn't hear him, just I could see on his face he was saying no, and he put his hands up like that. I had to go back and try to stabilize the airplane, and when I did that, the fire had spread into the instrument panel, and I couldn't even approach the pilot's seat.
Oh, man.
And so I got burns all over on the right side of my face and neck and arm. And the lucky thing about it for us, the 2 of us, was that we landed very close to the town of Halle, Halle, in Germany. And Halle was a town of about 250,000 people, as contrasted with Merseburg, which had maybe 20,000 or some such, and that big plant. There was a Luftwaffe field at Halle, and when I was coming down, I could hear a Focke-Wulf 190 flying around. I was out most of the time, but occasionally I would come to and I could hear and see this guy, wondering if he was gonna shoot me out of my chute or dump the parachute or what was he doing. And in hindsight, I have decided that what he was doing was telling people back at that Luftwaffe field where we were going to come down, the two of us. And when we got to the ground and landed, there were just dozens of these guys coming out of that Luftwaffe training field. And I think it was, without a doubt, something they had seen maybe many times, B-17s crashing around there. And they knew what they wanted, and it was all the escape kit items that were on our backs. That included about $1,500 of German money, and it also a 45 caliber pistol and some food, what we called a D-bar, a very high calorie chocolate bar, delicious but almost too hard to bite. But they knew what they wanted, and they got that stuff out quickly, just rolled me over and over. But then they put both of us in, I think maybe separate, two little cars, and I know when I was put in the back seat of that car and we started out, I couldn't figure that out. It sounded so strange, that car. And years and years later, when we began to import Volkswagens in this country, I thought, boy, that's what that was. It was a Volkswagen. And they had a characteristic sound of their own. But they took us to the jail there in Holly. And at that jail, the medic came over from the Luftwaffe field, and my top turret gunner had landed kind of crooked, and I think he must have bruised or sprained his ankle very severely. I wondered if it had been broken, but it hadn't. I found out later that he wrapped that ankle and just got that all fixed up in beautiful shape. And talking to the guy, my gunner in later years, he said it never bothered him again. And he bandaged my burns, and it was over this eye and down under the neck, and one big area where I was reaching out to try to stabilize the airplane in that last effort. And but the guy did a really magnificent job with the bandages, both of us. Mine had to last 2 weeks without being touched. I was taken from that jail, I think the next day, to Frankfurt, at what they called Stalag Luft. It was an interrogation center for air crews, and put in solitary confinement. And they would come in every day for about a week and badger us to give them information that most of which we didn't have anyway, didn't know that much. I told them I was just a second lieutenant. I guess I'd been promoted and didn't realize it to first lieutenant, but I was a dumb second lieutenant. I didn't know anything. And so I couldn't tell them anything of value, and just name, rank, and serial number. But they told me where I lived, the address of my home, and about my family, and then talked about certain officers in the bomb group. Is he still there? Is this guy still over there?
Wow.
Boy, they had the names of just unbelievable
Yeah.
number and of people, and people that would surprise you. Just
Yeah.
their intelligence was very good.
Yeah.
But then we went to the Stalag Luft interrogation center for a week about, and then for another week on a train ride from there, from Frankfurt up to the town of Barth in northern Germany, about as far as you can go, up right on the Baltic Sea, where Stalag Luft 1 was. And that trip took about a week. It was, actually it was 13 days. We shot down on the 13th of September. That was the 26th when I got up there. So that bandage had lasted all that time and did not get infected.
Hmm.
And I just thought the guy had to do a very good job,
Hmm.
or it wouldn't have lasted that
Yeah.
long. But after being in the hospital there at the camp, treated by a Scottish doctor, a doctor who had been taken prisoner in Dunkirk, if you can imagine that. And so he'd been around quite a while before I ever got to the POW camp. But he treated these burns and for 3 weeks, and then I went to the compound and was assigned to a room there in the barracks. And but after a couple of days, well, this, the barracks and all the things that we handled in the barracks were not clean. Sanitation was about the bottom of the list for priorities, and this had not quite healed. And I woke up one morning with a big red streak up my arm, and so I went to the captain, who was the senior officer in this barracks, and told him I needed to go to the hospital and get this treated. And boy, they got me over there in just a very short time, less than an hour. And they treated that sore with the sulfa drugs and wrapped it. Never had another problem.
Yeah. Wow.
And, but that was mid-October when I got over there moved into the barracks. And then as we approached the end of the year, thinking about what we ate and what we had probably half a Red Cross parcel per man per week when I got to the barracks in mid-October. And it was supplemented by some of their real heavy dark bread and potatoes and rutabagas and that kind of thing that we could cook in our room in the barracks. And that diet went on like that until Christmas. And I think the Red Cross must have sent some special parcels for Christmas to the camps. And as I remember, there was something they called plum pudding, like an old traditional meal in many, many families in parts of the country. But anyway, overall it was the best meal I'd had since we got to that camp.
Yeah.
But the sad part was that starting right at that time, our Red Cross parcels stopped. And we had 0 Red Cross parcels until late in March. And they, as you might imagine, well, let me back up. I think I've read in more recent years that the very same thing happened at the same time in all of the Luft POW camps. Stalag Luft 1, Stalag Luft 3 and Stalag Luft 4. And we didn't leave the camp in Stalag Luft 1, but these other people had their Red Cross parcels stopped as of Christmas, and then most of them evacuated their camps because the Russians were coming to Stalag Luft 4, which was over in Poland, and Stalag Luft 3 was for officers in the Air Corps, and it was just barely in Poland, I believe. Sagan, I believe is where it was. I think it was Sagan, as I remember. But they had their food cut off, and they had to evacuate because of Russians coming, and marched all around Germany, just for the most part, I think, not knowing where they were going, because the Germans just had to get them out of there and keep them where there were no Russians, no Americans, no British, and they would get food from farmers as they marched around. But that was a record cold winter.
Right, yeah.
And a lot of these people that were marched around like that were on foot out there in that winter for 80 some days. And they finally took them to Moosburg down by Munich, and that was where they were collecting all these prisoners that had been displaced from their prisoner of war camps. And they eventually had something like 100,000 prisoners down there until they were liberated by Patton in April.
Roughly how big was Stalag Luft 1 prisoner, you know?
Well, in September, they gave us a kind of a dog tag, and mine was 5577, 5577 was my number. And by the time the war was over in May, there were almost 10,000 people there. That's how it had grown in that short period of time. And but with this Red Cross business, our senior Allied officer, Colonel Zemke, had tried to make a deal with the German commandant about these Red Cross parcels, because the international Red Cross people said there were lots and lots of parcels in Sweden, and they knew they were being shipped to Germany, and so we didn't have anything to complain about. They were rather close with the Germans, and didn't ask for many things to be confirmed. And they were stacking up in Sweden by the thousands, but none of them being shipped to us, to the port of Rostock, maybe 40, 50 miles from our camp. But Colonel Zemke talked with the commandant and asked if they could begin to get those Red Cross parcels that the Swiss guy said were there. And he said, well, no, they couldn't spare any personnel to go and get them at Rostock. But Colonel Zemke said, well, we would furnish as many men as you want on that truck, POWs, and we guarantee not to hurt your driver, not to injure him at all. We'd load that truck and bring it back here and unload it. And we would do that as many times as necessary if you will allow our people to help your one driver with the truck. And he finally agreed to that in late March. And boy, the Red Cross parcels just poured in then. And but we were, the prisoners were literally starved by that time and extremely weak, which I think probably was the reason that the parcels were cut off in the first place. So we'd be too weak to give anybody any trouble.
Mm.
And but by the time we began to get them again, of course, they could see the writing on the wall, I'm sure,
Yeah.
in the end of March. So we did get them, and we were advised to eat very, very sparingly, because we would get sick if we ate too much, and it could kill us if we ate too much. And so as we began to eat some food, everybody got sick, just couldn't tolerate even the smallest amount of food.
Mm.
And we just, made fun of our buddies that were sick. If all of them that weren't sick yet, told them how horrible they looked and all that kind of thing. But everybody eventually got sick, and it just, but in about 2 weeks of having food again, we began to come out of it fairly fast then, especially in the second week or later. And by the end of April, we were feeling much better. We weren't over the hump yet, but we sure felt better.
Yeah.
And then, the end of April, the Germans they had the reports that the Russians were very close, and that the Americans and British were not far away on the other side of the camp area. And they didn't want to see those Russians at all, because they knew that if the Russians got there and their Germans were still there, they'd kill them all.
Mm-hmm.
And so the commandant wanted to remove all the German guards and every single person that had anything to do with the camp, but he wanted assurance that we wouldn't try to obstruct their departure, and because we could have, with almost 10,000 people, just could have overwhelmed the few guards that were, and probably had 1,000 of our people killed too in the process. But they agreed to that, and on the night of April 30th, we could hear them, the guards and their dogs over there packing up and getting ready to go. They were just yelling like it was a riot of some sort. And the dogs were, you'd think it was a horrible dog fight of some nature. But then about 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, it was just silent. And the Germans were gone, and next day the Russians came in.
Well, I'll be darned.
But-
Can I have you back up and talk about what it was like, what living conditions were like there in the camp, your sleeping conditions, a little bit about the food, what you guys do to pass time and entertain yourself, just daily life in the camp?
Well, that was, I guess kind of bleak. We didn't think of it that way, I guess. But we had 3 triple deck beds in the room, and there were 6 of them, so that 18 people could be in this room, which was barely big enough for all those people. We had sort of a picnic-like table made out of 2x4 and 2x6s sitting there and a bench on each side for all the occupants to eat in shifts when the time came. But we fixed the foods that were in the Red Cross parcels, and also boiled the potatoes and the rutabagas and cabbage and things of that sort that the Germans furnished to us, so that we got by okay until the Red Cross parcel stopped. And but each week, I don't know that it was handled this way in every single room, every single barracks. But each week in our room, one guy was in charge of the food. He was the cook for the week. And he would do all this work in preparing what we had in the best way they could figure out to do it. And it worked out very well. And I think maybe one of the things that this I hadn't thought of either until later, after we got home, that nobody ever stole any food in our room.
Really?
All these guys, as hungry as they were, and as little food as we had, nobody ever stole any. And that tells you a little about the people who were there.
Yeah, right.
And I thought that was a pretty good sign. But it's the food that we were given by the Germans was not really good. I had never heard of these rutabagas, and when I got home, I found they were in the grocery stores after all, and my wife actually purchased them a couple of times just for some experiments. But in the Red Cross parcels, when they were arriving, and we would get things mailed from home too.
Oh, you would?
Yes.
And that would get through?
I think I got 2 parcels mailed from home.
Oh.
And but they couldn't be very big, not much in them. But this one guy got a parcel from home and that had cinnamon in it. And so he didn't tell anybody about that, but he said when he was going to be the cook, well, he said, we're going to have apple pie tonight. Oh yeah, sure. Nobody believed that, but what he had done was take these rutabagas, cut them up like pieces of apple, and cook them in there, and spread cinnamon on them. And man, I tell you, when we smelled cinnamon, that had to be apple pie.
Wow.
And we just thought that was great. And then he told us what it was, and boy, that was a letdown. But he really did a job on our senses in putting the cinnamon on there and convincing us it was apple pie.
Now, did the food get progressively worse as the war went on and Germany got more desperate? And I imagine they couldn't feed their population, let alone trying to feed you guys, did it?
That's right. They what they furnished us, I think, was getting worse, and and more sparse too, of course. But it was obvious that food was in short supply everywhere.
Right.
For the Germans and these POWs. And when we got all these Red Cross parcels after the end of March, and they stacked up in the warehouse in the camp, after the Germans left, our folks went over there where they had been stored, and there were just hundreds and hundreds of them, maybe thousands. And the German people came over and would be given these Red Cross parcels. And boy, they were as enthusiastic about getting them as we were. And they needed them in the worst way. And
Well, for example, I'd heard in doing other interviews that they discovered in the bread recipes was like 40% sawdust. Did you have that experience?
Well, it seemed like it could be sawdust, and I just didn't let myself think that they'd put sawdust in bread.
Yeah.
But I heard later that they sure did.
Yeah.
And that puffed it up and made you think you had some bread, but there was probably more flour than sawdust, but there was sawdust in it.
Yeah, I'll be darned. What would you guys do to pass the time? What would
Well, one of the things we would do was just go out and walk around in the compound, and for some exercise. We needed the exercise and to help us keep halfway in shape as much as anything else, as much as we needed food, really. And the walking came to a standstill pretty much when we lost the Red Cross parcels, and as it went on and on and on, week after week, people weren't out there walking very much.
you were getting weaker, or is that?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. But we did walk some, and when we were getting enough food to be halfway normal, we'd go down to this, I think they called it the bathhouse, but there sure wasn't any bath there. There was a big round basin. I would guess this thing might have been between 6 and 8 feet in diameter. And in the middle of it, it had water spouts that you could turn on, and you get this water to wash with, to shave with, and clean up as well as possible. No showers. We didn't have anywhere near enough water or even facilities for a shower. We didn't have a shower from the day I got there till after it was gone.
Is that right?
And that water coming out of there was just, we'd think, how can that water be that cold and not be ice? And it was just, it was, in that winter, there was no heat in that building, and yet the water would flow, and boy, it was cold, but it was water, and that was the only water we had. And to cook and to drink any water, we'd take these big old buckets and put water in them and take them back to the barracks to use in the room, and clean up dishes and to drink and so on and so forth. But that was the source right there.
Wow. Were you in the actual barracks, particularly with that cold winter, did you stay warm enough in there with the stove, or was it, were you comfortable in there, or?
Well, our fuel was limited, so we couldn't just really warm up the room, but it would warm it up a little when we were cooking whatever we had, and so it did help considerably.
Wow.
And but what we had in these bunks was Excelsior. Does Excelsior ring a bell with you?
Oh, explain it to those that'll watch what that is.
What?
Explain to those that are watching this what that is.
Well, it's not sawdust. It's kind of ground up wood in strands, inches long, and then it's stacked to act as a mattress or a pillow, or we would use it as packing, you might say.
Okay.
To pack things with, keep them from breaking. Well, that's what our mattresses had. They had this Excelsior packed bag, and that was our mattress. But the air could flow through that thing, and when we would sleep, we would put almost everything we had on us, over us like a blanket to keep as warm as possible. But the cold was still coming through that darn mattress, and but that was the covers. We had one blanket of sorts for each bed, and but I think all that kind of stuff, a GI blanket, and clothes too, and several other things came from the YMCA. They let the YMCA send things to POWs, and I had a pair when I I was shot down in September. It was a warm day, and I had on the lightest weight suntans that we had in uniforms. Sorry.
Drink of water there.
Let me get you some more.
But I didn't have anything warm. What we had when we hit the ground was these electrically heated suits, and they were all wired properly to heat your body from head to toe, from chest, neck to toe, and the suit that we put on was from about ankle height on up, just like a flight suit, and we would plug in the gloves so you keep your hands warm,
Right.
and plug in the boots that your shoes, your feet were in, and then we had a pair of old red galoshes on our feet. And I don't know if you remember seeing those from years and years ago, but they were probably about that high, about halfway up your calf, and but when the parachute snap opened up, well, those were gone, and all we had was these doggone felt like electric socks, and couldn't plug them in anywhere. So I think the Germans took them away from us somewhere, maybe even in Holly was where they took them. And but I got a pair of pants, World War I pants, they said that they were, and wool pants, khaki, you know, and a khaki shirt too. And but these pants that I got, my waist was 29 inches around in those days, and it's kind of slipped. It's down over the years, and but these pants must have been 40 something.
Oh, jeez.
And so again, the YMCA furnished little sewing kits, you know, needles and thread. And so I took these pants and put the back pockets together, you know, just as far as you could pull it, and sewed up that seam in the back. And I put great big old pleats in the front. And I don't know if you ever remember seeing or hearing about the zoot suits that were worn during the war. Well, they were strange looking things. But these big old pleats and having the pockets together in the back almost fit me. And so that's how the warmer pants turned out, and it sure was a help.
How was it? You talked about, you know, walking around and such for the physical health. How did you stay healthy mentally, or were you able to maintain your mental health, or did you get down and depressed, or how was that period of time being confined?
Well, we had access to books.
Oh.
There again, that had been sent by, I suppose, YMCA, because some of these books were pretty odd, and I don't know whether there were really some good ones in there. I'm sure there must have been. I remember reading one, Cyrano de Bergerac, you know, but it was written in England. A lot of these books were English, and British English, and so they were a little bit harder to read. But the point was that we had books to read, and we would read whatever was available to us. So I studied a little Spanish while I was in the camp too, and lots of people did, I'm sure.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the day you finally, the Russians come in and you're finally free. Talk about how that all came together and what that day was like.
Well, that was really a glorious day, you might say. And just hours after the Germans left, here came the Russians, and there was a Russian. Their idea, everywhere they went, I guess, was to just tear up everything and burn it, and just leave parched ground behind them. And that's what they wanted to do with this camp. And the first guy that got there was in a tank, and he came up to the fence. There was a double fence, a barbed wire here and coiled barbed wire between the two fences. Another fence over here, a barbed wire, and he was just gonna mow down all this stuff, and his track just got tangled up in all that barbed wire, and he couldn't go anyplace. So we thought that was the funniest thing we'd seen since we got there. But that very day, a Russian general got there to the camp, and along with some other officers and people, but he was in a Lend-Lease Jeep, and when he got there, why, there in a book that I've read, they took a picture of him, standing in this Jeep. He just looked like he'd conquered the world, looking all around, and I thought it was particularly funny because it was Lend-Lease piece of property.
Yeah.
And but the Russians wanted to move these prisoners to Russia.
Oh, jeez.
And again, Colonel Zemke helped stop that. While he had grown up in a German home in North Dakota, or not North Dakota, Montana, he spoke German when he was a child until he got to kindergarten, and his parents, of course, spoke German at home. They were both immigrants to this country, and so they had Zemke in 1941 go with P-40s that were being sent to Russia, again as Lend-Lease material. We were sending as much as we could to Russia and Britain to help them fight the Germans. And these P-40s were shipped over there in boxes. They were just disassembled and put in boxes and shipped to Russia. And they sent Zemke over there when he wasn't Colonel Zemke at that time. He was probably a captain or some such. And but he'd been in the Air Corps for a long time, since the late 30s. And they want him to go over there and show them how to assemble these planes, put them together, and how to maintain them, and then how to fly them. And but so he did that and learned a little Russian in the process. He had to get any communication with these people, and so that helped him when talking with the Russians who would come into our camp. And so he finally talked to the Russians. I suppose this general was the principal guy to decide that they wouldn't take us out to Odessa, because I believe that's where they wanted to go, and that Zemke wanted to have B-17s come into this little Luftwaffe field, which was about 2 miles from our camp, and it wasn't an active fighter base. I don't know what good it was, but it was there as an airfield. And he wanted to get B-17s to come in there and pick us up and fly us to France on the be processed to be sent home. And finally the Russians agreed to do that. They got there the 1st of May, and about the 10th of May they agreed to let our airplanes fly in their airspace. Mm-hmm. You know, we own this now. And so they, on the 12th and 13th and 14th of May 1945, they came in and picked us up and flew out almost 9,000 people in that period of time, those 3 days.
Wow.
Just one B-17 after another. And so that was a glorious day for sure.
Took you back down to what, Camp Lucky Strike, or where'd you?
Lucky Strike is
Yeah.
where we went. Yes, that was close to the Havre in France, and that was a tent city.
Yeah.
You know, everything there was housed in a tent of some sort, and a massive darn place. I used to think it was something like 20,000 people. I don't know if that was accurate or not, but it was a lot of people there living in tents and having their food prepared in other tents, and we had physicals there, and they issued clothing to some extent, and just taking the best care of these POWs they could until they were ready to go to Le Havre and be shipped home. That's where most of us went by these Liberty ships.
Okay.
Those Liberty ships, most of them I guess have been made by Kaiser shipbuilding company, and they were small ships that had been built to carry freight of all sorts, and I don't think they carried very many troops until the war was over, and then they did. And we got out of there in the 9th of June and got home, or home to New Jersey on the 20th of June. The reason I remember that is that was my sister's birthday, the 20th of June, and it was also normally the start of strawberry shortcake season in Kansas. And boy, I was looking forward to both of those things.
Bet.
So that getting home was where we wanted to be, every one of us.
Oh, I can't imagine what that homecoming must have been like when you got back home to the folks.
It was great. They sent each one of us by train to wherever we lived in the country, and we had 60 days at home. That was the plan. And then at the end of the 60 days, we were sent to Miami Beach, where they wanted to get all these ex-POWs, Luft POWs, Air Corps people, in there to Miami Beach and get them processed and physicals run and interrogation, ask them all kinds of questions about what had happened to them, how they were treated, and so forth. But then we had a hurricane in Miami Beach, in Miami, and boy, that was some experience in itself. That's the first hurricane I'd ever seen.
Yeah, the Kansas boy in a hurricane. Yeah.
No, we didn't have anything like that.
Yeah.
So that also in that 60-day period, my wife and I were married in the middle of July.
Now, is this someone you had known prior to the war, or someone you had met during this time period?
She had come to my hometown in September '42 while I was waiting to be called to active duty. She was a new kindergarten teacher, And so this was her first year in Concordia, and she came there to teach, and I met her. A friend of mine and I met two of the teachers there, and just really had a good time double dating with them, and it was just great. And but I was impressed more than you would imagine with the girl I met. I thought she was top notch.
Now, was when you went off overseas? How did you leave it? Were you engaged, or
Well,
let's wait till we get back, sort of thing?
No
or?
guarantees.
Yeah.
I didn't want to be engaged, and I certainly didn't want to get married.
Yeah.
Because
The uncertainty.
the odds of coming back were not too great.
Yeah.
And so I there was kind of an unwritten situation that when I got back, we
Okay.
probably would get married.
Okay.
And so, boy, I called her as soon as I could when I got back.
And did she come down to Miami with you then, or was or
Yes,
is that...
she did.
Okay.
She came. Her home had been in Tonganoxie, Kansas, down by Kansas City, and she was working in San Diego as a reservationist for Western Airlines, and not teaching. Her sister was in San Diego with two little children, about a year and 2.5 years, something like that, the two girls. So she, in talking with her sister, it looked like a good idea for her to move to San Diego and help her take care of those girls while her husband was in the Pacific. And so they were, the two of them were there, and just really doing fine, I think, with Jean helping her sister with the two little children, and Jean working for Western Airlines in the process. And but I called her then when I got home, and she was still with Western Airlines, and made herself a reservation to go to Kansas City and meet me.
I'll be doing that.
But in those days, the military had the priority for every air flight, and so she got bumped in Albuquerque, and so she had to take a train then from Albuquerque to Kansas City, and that's when we finally got together again.
Oh, what a wonderful story. Yeah. So now you're down in Miami. Is that where you got mustered out, or what? Take your story from Miami.
At that time, of course, going in, getting there before the end of the war, really.
Yeah, still going on.
Yeah, I think it was. We hadn't heard what was going to happen. It was early in August when we heard that the atomic bomb, the first one, had been dropped on Japan, but nothing seemed to change until the second one was dropped.
Yeah.
And so, but at first I thought I'd probably be sent to the Pacific.
So even after all you'd been through, they'd still had plans to send you to the Pacific?
Yeah, and I thought I might be needed, fly B-29 or something like that. And but fortunately that didn't happen.
Yeah.
And at Miami Beach, it became obvious to me that the best thing to do was get back in school just as quick as I could. And so I was sent to Leavenworth, Kansas, and discharged there, and then got enrolled over at Kansas State in September.
Able to take advantage of the GI Bill and...
Yeah.
How was that, after all you'd been through and being in the military, now transitioning back to civilian life? Was that much of an adjustment for you?
Oh, I didn't think of it as
No?
a
Oh,
age
okay.
adjustment. The I guess everybody had shortages of almost everything.
Yeah.
You couldn't even buy a toaster
You're right.
in those days, and and we were setting up housekeeping and couldn't buy a toaster. And well, what do you do? How do you make toast? And all kinds of things were short. You could buy a radio, and finally did get one 6 months later after we tried, and but everything was short. Cars in particular,
Yeah.
I didn't get a car till 49, and that was with the help of my dad.
Ah.
That he got a local dealer in Concordia to agree to sell me one.
So you went back to K-State and got your degree then in engineering? Did you continue on
Yeah.
in engineering?
Yeah, and chemical engineering, finished in 49, and went to work in Chanute, Kansas for a little company that was doing, it was called oil field research, and they were working in the depleted and semi-depleted oil fields in southeast Kansas and in Oklahoma. And so I got really quick experience with the process of water flooding, and did the analysis of injected water. The quality of that water was important, and the quality of the water being produced was important. So all these little facets of water flooding were I got into real fast when I got to Chanute, and but following that was where things got more. I got more involved in the process of water flooding. We went to Evansville, Indiana, 1952, early 52, and set up a branch of oil field research. One of the partners and I went back there, and we were there for almost 20 years, working in the Illinois basin. And there, a lot of oil had been produced with these shallow wells in Illinois, Indiana, and Kentucky, and they were very susceptible to water flooding, and the water flooding was very successful in that area if it was done right, and most people got the system worked out and did it right, and it just produced millions of barrels of oil out of these wells or out of these fields that had just practically been shut down.
Yeah.
Because no pressure to produce oil. They wouldn't pump very much per day with no pressure, very low pressure. But with the water flooding, it kicked up this rate of production and produced millions of barrels of oil in that area. And but that went on for me for about 20 years in that area in out of Evansville, and but in 1971 I was with Ashland Oil at that time, and their headquarters was Ashland, Kentucky, and I was sent to Ashland, Kentucky for a time, but in 75 they transferred me to Denver, and they had bought some properties in Wyoming and some in North Dakota and so forth. Their big production was Wyoming. But I worked in that until 1977, and not quite 2 years, but from late 75 to early 77 we were in the Denver area. And then I was transferred to Houston to work in that area for a much wider variety of oil fields and so forth, working with offshore production in the Gulf of Mexico, and they had some production in Nigeria at that time. I didn't have anything to do with it, but they also produced oil in the North Sea, and so Ashland was spread out, really expanding into almost worldwide production. Worldwide production on a very small scale comparatively,
Yeah.
compared with Standard Oil,
Right.
and so on. And there, in 1979, just a couple of years after going to Houston, somebody in Ashland, Kentucky, in the chairman's office, got his ear and told him that they thought that their production in the Illinois Basin and West Virginia and offshore in the Gulf of Mexico and everywhere around could be sold, and they could get $1 billion for it. You know, the price of oil had been $2.80 a barrel for a long, long time. From the 60s, really right almost to the late 70s. And suddenly the price was changing, and it had gone to $5 a barrel. And that was almost double. And which was fantastic, people thought. That's why this fellow said, I think you could get $1 billion for all this production and get rid of it. Because they were a refining company and really not as interested in production as a pure producing company might be. Well, we in Houston with Ashland, we had a lot of fun working ourselves out of a job. We evaluated all these properties that were for sale, and then talked to all the prospective buyers that might be interested in buying the properties. And for one reason or another, some of them couldn't be sold because the price of the products were uncertain. And the Nigerian thing was, for one reason or another, was not sold at that time. It was a few years later. But the properties in West Virginia, for instance, were not sold because they had 2 or 3 categories of gas, tight gas and gas from this formation, this type of production, and they were different prices set by the government. And some of them, I think 30 some cents per MCF, where later on it was $5. Now it's about $2 per MCF, per million BTU is what it really sells for. And but the price was uncertain because the government set these things. When they do that, they just as easily can change it and have a different set of prices 6 months from now. So nobody wanted to buy these properties, and Ashland had to keep them and continue to produce them. And another fellow and I, a geologist, we got together and decided to write a report on what the potential of these fields were, and that this geologist had in his area, he was responsible for these particular fields, massive amount of land. It was land owned by lumber companies in West Virginia. They owned thousands of acres over there, and Ashland had the leases on them, but they just sat there paying rent on them every year. And so where they were producing some wells, well, we wrote a program about report about what might be developed in that area. And anyway, to make that story shorter, that report was used 10 years later by Ashland to keep drilling where we had recommended drilling, and it worked out very, very well. And those properties were not sold for many, many years after that, but sold at very attractive prices.
Now, did you retire then from Ashland? Is that where you finished out your career?
Well, and when we sold ourselves out of jobs in Houston, I was paid to stay until they had sold everything that was going to be sold, and then I went with Keplinger and Associates consulting firm there, and that was even more interesting than the Ashland work, because they did work on so many properties all over the world, and I was able to do reservoir engineering on some of those properties, and it was extremely interesting to me. And but I stayed with them when I went with them. They were in 1979. They were just beginning to do studies on properties in the Gulf of Mexico, part of the Gulf of Mexico, that had been assigned to Keplinger and Associates by the minerals management part of the government, and this other section to another consulting firm, and on and on. They had probably 4 different consulting firms evaluating that whole Gulf of Mexico, and so that was interesting. I had never worked with the Gulf production until then, and but that I worked with them until went with them in fairly late '79, and retired then when I was 66 in 1989, and but it was a very pleasant experience with that company, and pleasant in what we worked with, not pleasant in the time that we experienced in the oil industry, because probably from 82 particularly into 86 and along in there, the oil industry was just in shambles, and companies were going broke, and it was a tough time for them.
Wow.
And as a matter of fact, all these banks in Houston who had made loans to oil companies, I don't know of any bank, there may be something I hadn't heard about, but I don't know of any bank except one in Houston that was not taken over by it wasn't reconstruction, but it was the same thing, taken over and merged with some other bank. No bank there had the same name except this one bank, and it was run by a family, and it's still running today. And but
so how many years
what a
old?
horrible time. There were just people fired by the thousands in Houston, and I felt very fortunate to be involved in the business until I was 66 years old.
How many years altogether then were you in the industry? How long was your career?
Oh, about 40 years,
40
from
years.
49 to 89.
Wow. Well, talk a little bit about family. Children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren?
Yeah, we had 2 girls early on. One girl born in 1949, October, and the second girl was born in 1952, February. And when we moved to Evansville, Indiana, we moved her to Evansville when she was 3 weeks old, And in 1956, then our son was born. So we had 3 children, 2 girls and a boy. And both the girls went to school in Indiana, and at Indiana University. And one of them moved to Denver when we did, and in 75, she and her husband had been married a short time then, and she eventually became a school psychologist in the Jefferson County school system, and worked in Powderhorn Elementary School, which is southwest, out in the Sims and Coal Mine Road area. And she just retired in about 2014. So that was she had quite a career as a school psychologist, working with students who needed particular help, and those numbers seemed to grow as the years went by, with more and more kids needing help.
Yeah.
Her other daughter went to school at Indiana, but then went on to Harvard and got her
Know where we're going?
degree there.
And your son?
And our son, he and his wife, they were married in 76. They were both went to high school in Ashland, Kentucky. They came out here for a time, and just before we abandoned them and went to Houston, and they moved back to Ashland and have been there ever since. And he still lives there in Ashland. He later took nurses training, and is an RN in the hospital there in Ashland, Kentucky.
Grandchildren, great-grandchildren? How many?
Yes, we had 4 grandchildren, 2 in Ashland, Kentucky, and 2 here in Denver with our daughter and son-in-law, who lived here then and still live here today.
Any greats?
Yes, we have six great-grandchildren.
And how long were you and your wife married before her passing?
It was 68 years when she died in 2013.
Wow.
Yeah, we had some wonderful years.
Yeah, wow. Through the years, did you ever keep in touch with any of your surviving crew members, or anybody that you were in the gulag or the Stalag with? I mean, was there any sort of reunions? Did you keep in touch?
Yes, particularly crew members. I got in touch with some of them right after the war. The tail gunner was the best correspondent of all of them. He lived in little town of Irwin, Tennessee, and before the war, and went to work for the railroad there after the war, and was there when he died. He died in 1993, and also I got together with the ball turret gunner who had lived in Kansas, and it took me a long time to find him because I thought he lived in Hays, Kansas. He lived in Hayesville, and Hayesville is a suburb of Wichita, and I looked all over Hays, Kansas for him time after time when we drove through there, and finally found somehow that he lived in Hayesville, and my wife and I visited him several times, and his wife had died before we got to visit with him. And then I saw my top turret gunner, the first top turret gunner, in the first crew I had, well, in the crew I went overseas with.
Okay.
And he was injured in England by an RAF truck hit him one night when he was walking across, coming back to the base from being somewhere. The only lights those vehicles could have
Right.
were just little slits,
Yeah.
about an inch wide and 6 inches long. And they didn't see him walking along the road, and they hit him and injured him terribly. And so he never flew anymore after that. He flew about 4 or 5 missions with us, and then was injured like that. And it was just a really sad situation. But I did see him again in 2001 in Minneapolis, St. Paul, Minnesota, when we had a reunion there in September 2001. And he was living in Duluth, Minnesota, and came down to visit one evening while we were there, and it was just great to see him again.
Wow. Wow. Well, as we start to wind down this interview, is there anything I didn't ask you that you wanted to talk about, or any of the stories that have floated to the top as we've been sitting here talking, so that ideally we round out your story as best we can, or do you think we captured it? Were you happy with what we captured?
Well, I think we pretty well covered the ground, and I don't know of anything else that I might add to it.
Okay.
There.
Well, the last question I always like to ask in these interviews, when you look back on that time in the service, and particularly what you went through, do you look back, did it change your life, affect your life, play a role in your life, or was it simply just a chapter in your life that you went through? How would you answer that, do you think?
Oh, I don't know. I think it changed my life. I think it worked that way for most people. We used to say we went into service as a boy and came out a man. And, that was kind of a stock statement that they made in those years. But I think there was a lot of truth in that. And we just were changed a lot. And some people for the better, and I'm sure that many, many people were changed for the worse. That like it is today.
Yeah.
Maybe in many, many different ways. But I suspect there are not many people went into service and served for 2, 3, 4 years with no change.
Yeah.
I just think
Yeah.
everybody was probably changed some way or other.
Yeah. Well, Clayton, I want to thank you for sitting down to tell your story today, but more importantly, I want to thank you for your service to our country.
Well, thank you. Picture of me in the end of August 1943, when I was first commissioned and received my wings in the Army Air Corps. This is a picture of me when my wife Jean and I were in Colorado Springs for our honeymoon. In this picture I was out at the Garden of the Gods, where we were exploring this big park that we had never seen before. This is a picture that was taken of me in 2013 for a church directory.